Welcome to Almost Professionally Photoshopped. In this edition, we're going to take this wonderfully composited elephant that has a lot of good principles, and we're going to make it even better with some advanced Photoshop skills. Let's begin. So to start, we have our elephant walking down Chinatown, which probably isn't going to happen in the real world, but Photoshop, anything can happen. Let's go ahead and break down the picture. We have some contrast, some brightness contrast layer. And I find brightness contrast layers at the very top of your file are a good way to make things kind of blend together, to maybe hide any little defects or problems with your editing. So putting a darkening layer just helps to kind of help everything come together. Sometimes it's like a fog layer or a dust layer or another layer just to kind of bring some atmosphere on the very top and to help cover up the little blemishes or mistakes that we make. So that's just a good choice. Maybe a little bit heavy-handed. I'm going to go ahead and say, let's go to the brightness contrast, and maybe not go quite so dark, because it's taking a nice bright piece and it's toning it down, which I think we can do, but we're going pretty extreme. Let's go into like a negative 40, something like that. So it's going to be brighter than it was, but not as bright as what we've had in the past. So from here, that's no editing. Definitely helps to brighten it up a little bit, I think. I think that helps just to give it a little brighter tones. We'll go through the levels again. This one, I'm not really seeing much of a change. According to the settings, nothing's changed. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete it. We have layers that are doing nothing. It just complicates your file, and it makes it harder when you want to make edits into the future. This layer here is a way to kind of warm up the elephant. What he did, he went ahead and selected his elephant. You can actually take your edit and click on that layer. Now your selection is reselected, so you don't have to go to that compositing work again. And then he went ahead and painted over that on a blank layer. That's okay. But there's a better way. I'm going to go ahead and delete that layer. And I'm going to come to this layer now of my elephant. And I'm going to go ahead and just put an adjustment layer that's already going to be clipping mask. I'll talk about that in a second. And do it this way. So I'm going to go ahead and take this layer. I'm not noticing any difference at all. The brightness contrast was tried, but it's really not doing anything at all. I'm going to go ahead and turn that one off, delete it because it's not doing anything. Also then we can go ahead and add an adjustment layer. And we're going to go ahead and warm up the elephant because the elephant's a much different color than the very warm tungsten lighting at the street. So we're going to go ahead and go into our color balance. And I'm going to just change it a little bit more red tone. So we can go extreme, so it's going to be more red all over. But remember, I'll do the clipping mask here in a second. A little bit something like that. I'm going to go ahead and now that this piece is affecting everything below it, right click on the right side, not on the left side. It is a different set of contextual menus if you click on the left or the right side. Right click over here and hit create clipping mask in the middle. Once a create clipping mask is done, now this effect is only happening to this layer. Now I can be a little more precise. And at some level, I can make him look like a very nuclear orange red color of an elephant, which is not what I want to do. But I'm going to give it some warm colors. Something like that, just to warm him up a little bit. Maybe a little yellow tones as well. And that's going to help make him blend in a little bit better than what he did to begin with. Then I have my layer of my elephant. I have got the cutout here. Now, this is not necessarily the way I would have done it. We've went ahead and actually deleted pixels. So if I would have made a mistake with my masking here, I've actually permanently, you see the little black and white checkerboard pattern here. It's actually deleted pixels or removed things in here, which wouldn't necessarily be the best way to do it if we had made a mistake with our masking. But fortunately, the masking looks pretty good here. It's a good cutout of our elephant. So the good job of making the selection with things like smart selection and some of the artificial intelligence options. It's really getting really easy and fairly accurate to make the hard parts, the mask and the edits, done in Photoshop. So it's doing a much better job than we have seen in the past. So that looks pretty good. So I don't think I'm going to necessarily worry about editing him here. But the big piece that we can improve on a little bit is to change how we're actually having him blend in. Because here was the original shot of just Chinatown. We put in the elephant, and what it looks like you copied an elephant and just pasted him on top because that's what we've done. We add shadow, and he tried some shadows here to add a little bit of shadow. We can see there's a light in the scene, and it's casting some shadow, and you did a good job with the shadow, making it come across. What you do is you go ahead and just create a blank layer. I'm going to actually add a little more shadow because, yes, there's the light behind him that's coming off in this direction, but there's multiple little light sources. You got the lights, the lamp, you got the light bouncing off a building coming from the right to the left. There's 3 or 4 different light sources that we can see moving through. What I will do is I'll go ahead and study something. Like I can see the shadows in these trash cans, see the direction that they're following, and then try to mimic that. Now you have some artistic license between what's mimicked or what's not and what's real. But I'm going to go ahead and add a new layer. I'm going to add this one another shadow. And I'm going to just name mine. I like to do that just to keep it organized. Shadow left. I'm going to come in with a brush. And I'm going to go ahead and start to paint what that might look like. Right now it's going to be very obviously bright and enhanced. Something like that. What the elephant's going to look like, I have to kind of think, if the light's coming from the right side, it's going to create this kind of shape. And start to create that look in my piece. Something like that. What that wing will look like, maybe a little bit of the tusk in here, maybe a little smaller for the tusk. And at this point, yes, it looks very dark, but I'm going to make those edits and change them here in a little bit. Right up to the elephant. Something like that. And the key is in the next step. I have the elephant's shadow going in the direction that I think it might very well become. And it's also a soft edge. If you look at my brush settings, it's actually 0 hardness. So it's a very soft feather piece. I'm going to go ahead to my layers panel. On my layers panel, I'm going to go ahead and play with my opacity and turn my opacity down a bit. Now, at some point, I can turn it so it's basically invisible or completely invisible. But I want to see a little bit of shadow. Now, I think this isn't the dominant shadow. The shadow that he painted on his piece on the right side of the frame is probably the dominant shadow. But I'm going to make this one still there to play with a little bit. Something like 30, 35% painting it on like that. That looks pretty good. That's not bad. Now, some people paint in a shadow. Some people want to use adjustment layer for shadow. There are advantages to adjustment layers. And there's I can use like a levels or curves, and that's not a bad option. So I can actually have it change around the sign a little bit better, and that actually might not be a bad choice. I'm going to go ahead and try that as well. Maybe create another one with the curves. I'm going to go ahead and darken my curve so the road will get pretty dark here. Nothing right now. Everything's getting this equally dark. I'm going to go ahead and go to my mask. Go into my properties of my mask, and I'm going to flip it. So now nothing's happening. So nothing is having that effect until I start to paint white with a white brush. I'm going to start to paint back some of that. So I can start to form the white brush my shadow. Now I get it, there's a bit of an elephant in the room. We need to enhance this a little bit, like that. And then I'll go to my mask and layers, and the curves here allows me to brighten and darken, but I'm going to go ahead and change the highlights darker, maybe push the curves down a little bit. Something like that. Well, maybe keep the highlights up a little bit, keep the highlights dark, but change the midtones a little bit darker. You start to see something like that. Then it'll look a little different than the other direction. And that actually helps cover some of the bright sections in the yellow paint that are very, very bright. So by doing that, it does darken it up a little bit. Something like that I think is better. And I can then even change the opacity as well. So I have the option to still use opacity, but I can have a little more control on how that brights and darks interact, as you see here. Maybe something like that. So the brights are coming down. The midtones aren't being affected as much because I really want to affect the brights of the yellow paint. Okay, that's better. A little bit. Looking pretty good. I'm going to turn this shadow down a little bit. It's a little bit too intense for me because it's more of a secondary shadow. And this has probably 3 different light sources. So I'm going to create another one and another clipping mask or adjustment layer. Tone that one down. Remember, take it, flip it, and invert. Now I'm going to paint white to create a little bit of the shadow that will be coming from the elephant this way. Now I'm going to go ahead and make it more extreme so I can see what I'm doing at first. I'll adjust it later once I get the paint in the position I want. But something like this, and this large elephant beaming through the room, what that looks like with his big ear. Once I get the outline, I'm going to use a little bit bigger brush to go a little bit faster. Something like that. Okay, that looks pretty good. About like that. And then go back to my levels or my curves and adjust that so it's not as intense. Nothing happens, and let's darken out a little bit. So we're starting to see a little bit of that softness in there. About right. Now the beautiful thing about having a adjustment layer, you can do it with a blank layer as well, is I can edit the sharpness of it as well. So we click this mask where I've painted white. I'm going to go up to filter and I'm going to go ahead and blur it quite a bit. I can also do it through blur and actually it'll soften it. If it's a mask, an even better way is actually use my feather option in the layers panel. Old school way was doing that. I've done that in the past. I can come up to my feather tool and I can soften the edge of my selection. So it's a little more of a blurry shadow. So it's not as harsh of a shadow. The light's bouncing around in all different directions. The shadow will not be quite as defined, it's quite as harsh as we could. So if I go so much, it becomes almost invisible. But if I do just maybe a dozen pixels, it's just starting to soften that shadow, maybe even not even that much, 8 or 9 pixels. You can see that's starting to add some shadow. I could tone that back a little bit. It might be a little bit too much. Between adding a little bit of shadow, more shadow on that side, shadow on this side, it's starting to give it a feel that the elephant is actually in the room. Another last resort, this is the somewhat easier thing, is actually putting the elephant's shadow into the room, is if the light's behind the elephant, there'll actually be a little bit less light on the front of the elephant. Now we find the picture, he's got some light on the front, it was bouncing around in him in the field in Africa. But we need to tone down some of the brightness on the front if most of the lighting is coming from behind. Now, in reality, probably some light is coming from the front, like the front of our pictures, another street light's bouncing some light. So we're not going to tone it down completely, but we can maybe tone that elephant down a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and take my elephant. I'm going to go ahead and create an adjustment layer. I'm going to do a curves layer. I'm going to darken it down just a little bit. Now I can see, yep, I got the right layer. Let's make it just a little bit darker, something like that. Now I'm going to go take my mask. I'm going to invert it under the properties. So now nothing's happened. I'll take my mask. And I'm going to start to paint white, but I'm not going to do it 100% opacity. I'm going to go to my brush. I'm going to turn my brush down to maybe 20, 30, 40%, a lesser amount. So every time I click right now, I'm going to do 33% of that effect. So I click, and only 33% of that effect is happening. So it's a very subtle amount. Now, every time I click, it'll continue to do that 33%. So if I click, eventually click 4 or 5 times, about 99% of the effect is covered. So I like to do a lot of clicking, dragging with that 15, 20, 30% brush, something like that. That's just to kind of take a little bit edge. There should be a little bit less on the tusk, a little bit less on his inner legs because there's no light getting down there. Now, the way it's bouncing around the street, something like that. And let's turn that layer on and off. You can see it's subtle. Now you can salt and pepper to taste. You can also take a brush, go back to black, and then maybe put a little more light on the forehead. So between that and that, let's take a look at the piece. Before and after. Our changes have the original, subtle, adding some shadow, and making it a lot better. So I hope you enjoyed this video, making a Photoshop file that's been done fairly well, even more advanced, even better with some advanced Photoshop techniques.